Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar on the NCC 2022 energy provisions. We are recording today's webinar and we will upload the recording to our website as soon as possible after today's presentation finishes. And you will earn a 1 CPD point for attending today. Everyone who's joined us is on mute. And we have a question and answer session at the end of the webinar. So if you have a question in the meantime, please use the Q&A function, which is the little thing in the middle here with the very bottom blue arrow.
Sorry, Russ, the presentation is not being shared, mate. Just thought I'd let you know.
It says I am sharing my screen. Oh no, sorry guys, I'm going to stop and reshare. How is that?
Okay. That's good.
Is that sharing now?
Thanks, Daisy.
Okay. If you do have any questions, please use the Q&A function and type them in as we go. And when we do open up for questions, if you'd like to talk to us, please raise your hand using the raise hand function and we'll unmute you so you can talk. I'm not sure if I'm driving. We've got someone else next screen, please. We seem to be having some technical difficulties. I'm sorry for that, everybody. Try sharing my screen again. Can anyone tell me if they can see my screen, please?
Russ, we can share your screen. We can see it, mate.
We can. Oh, good. Thank you. Okay. Well, that's really thrown me off my game, hasn't it? Sorry for that. Okay, so just bear with me a second while I recalibrate, and we should be looking at a contents page now. Hopefully we all are. So we're going to talk about the scope and methodology. Just going to recap on the history. We're going to definitely talk about the key changes in NatHERS. We're going to go through the DTS elementals, its relationship with the verb, and some impacts there. We definitely want to talk about some of the verification using reference building, particularly for the class 2 single occupancy units, the new provisions there. Whole of house, we're going to go through a bit of an impact analysis. We're going to talk about the consultation regulatory impact statement, and we're going to have a bit of a Q&A session and consultation key questions at the end. Okay, so the public comment draft, which we're in now, or the consultation for the NCC has been run in 2 stages this time. Stage 1 covered all the content other than energy and condensation, and that's now closed. The current stage 2, which we're in now, has to do with energy and condensation, and that will close on the 17th of October. So to start off, as I said, we'll recap what changes were proposed in NCC 2022, and we'll talk about the scoping study. So many of you will probably remember this back in 2019, and the 2 options being considered by the ABCB at that time both set a minimum 7-star performance or stringency increase. Both introduced a whole of house annual energy budget, but the difference between the 2 was really just the level of stringency for that energy budget itself, being either net zero or near zero. Now, at the time, it wasn't clearly defined what these terms meant, but the general premise being that net zero being a target or perhaps a lower stringency level to be considered. Also considered were proposals to improve the DTS elemental pathways for class 1 and introduce both DTS and verification methods for class 2 single occupancy units or SOUs. The scope outlined a specific focus on residential buildings due to the substantial reforms that were made to commercial buildings in Section J 2019. So the results for the consultation were presented in the outcomes report, which was published in early 2020. The proposed increase to 7 stars attracted near unanimous support. It was very well endorsed. Both option 1 and 2 were supported, but there was no clear preference. And the whole of house methodology was widely endorsed as well. Proposed DTS development was attractive, was considered a good thing, but there were mixed opinions both in favour of and in favour for and against proposed class 2 SAU verification method. So to cap off, to kick off, it's probably best to talk about what the 7-star baseline target is, and fundamentally it's a NatHERS equivalent. So it makes sense to start with what this means from a NatHERS perspective. So nationally, around 76%, to be precise, of all building approvals are based on a NatHERS assessment, and NatHERS is currently the only compliance pathway for class 2 buildings. So the first and most significant change to NatHERS is the 7-star compliance, or the stringency level. NatHERS is being upgraded to take into account new provisions in the NCC for ceiling fans, which has been seen as an easy win in warm climates, as they are low-cost improvement, providing measurable benefits for ventilation and convective cooling, and are already a popular upgrade in many homes. NatHERS has also been upgraded to include assessment tools to support the whole of house methodology, and I'll go into that in more detail later in the presentation, so we'll just skip over that. But lastly, the NatHERS will now use the more modern climate data, and this has required a star rebanding project, which I'll discuss next. So currently NatHERS uses climate data, which is more than 30 years old. The new data files being used from 2022 onwards are more accurate and more granular than those previously used, and take into account the effects of climate change over the past 3 decades. Whilst this is generally seen as a good thing, it does create some variability in individual house ratings, even within the same climate zones. So as a result, NatHERS have undertaken a sizable project to rationalise the star banding to minimise impact, so that in theory, no individual rating will be impacted by more than half a star, with the vast majority being substantially impacted by much less. So fundamentally, the primary objective under the DTS reforms was to align DTS provisions with that same NatHERS 7-star outcomes, which is the benchmark for target stringency increases. This was necessary to underpin and support changes to the verification using reference building, or VERB methodology, to mandate minimum performance requirements for reference buildings, and to address gaming through the intentional misuse of the reference building method to achieve suboptimal outcomes, whilst giving the impression that the performance requirements had been met. A secondary objective of the new provisions was to introduce a DTS pathway for class 2 SAUs as an alternative approach to NatHERS. So updating the NatHERS approach to be more aligned with the outcomes generated under NatHERS required a wider range of issues to be considered. These included accounting for the benefits of passive ventilation through bigger windows and increased openability to offset solar heat gain in warm climates, the influence of thermal mass and slab-on-ground construction, which has higher tolerance for thermal gain compared to suspended timber floor or the second floor, room usage and zoning with bedrooms, which are typically smaller rooms and used primarily at night time, having a lower heating and cooling demand than living areas, and frame factors added to take into account the influence of frame color on solar absorbance. I should note that these factors are only new to the DTS pathway. They're already considered under NatHERS and have been forever. So they've only been added to the DTS in order to align DTS outcomes with the NatHERS. The proposed class 2 DTS provisions were designed to provide an alternate compliance pathway based on a process similar to the VERB method, or JV3 in volume 1, using a whole of facade or combined wall glazing performance approach. The initial proposal was based on a PMV, which means predicted mean vote, and is a thermal comfort metric. AGWA pretty strongly opposed this methodology as it was fundamentally flawed, not necessarily the PMV side of it, but it simply required thermal comfort levels for the proposed building to be no worse than the predicted thermal comfort levels in the identical space of the reference building model. The problem with this approach was that we highlighted was that this method did not include any minimum backstops for thermal comfort or minimum performance. Oops, sorry, I just lost my place. Oh my God. I'm sorry, guys. Here we go. I'm getting it. I'm coming back. I'm coming back. Bear with me. Okay. Right. The current NatHERS model requires a minimum 6-star average across all units, but mandates a minimum 5-star compliance level for any individual apartment. Whereas a proposed verb at that time merely required the PMV of each unit to be no worse than the PMV in the reference building. And we argue that this would lead to poor outcomes, potentially well below the minimum current compliance levels. Consequently, the ABCB abandoned the initial design and have formulated an entirely new approach, now based on overall heating and cooling loads. Importantly, these new provisions now also include minimum backstops that appear to limit any individual unit to no more than 120% of the energy budget. So a little bit of a win there. And under these proposed reforms, the reference building is quite tightly defined. The proposed method provides 2 options with regard to glazing. The first one being basically the same as the DCS provisions introduced in Section J 2019, so the commercial building whole of facade or wall glazing method, and prescribes minimum U values in climate zone 1 to 5. They're no more than 2.2, under 2 for 2.0 for climate zone 6, and under 1.4 for climate zone 7 and 8. These targets are slightly less stringent than for other building classes in the current JV3. The alternative is to model the reference building on the DTS provisions. You also note included in the PCD package, ABCB have published a beta version or beta versions of both the Class 1 and Class 2 glazing calculators. So we need to talk about whole of house and what does it mean? And if you Google it, you get this. And no, that's not what we're talking about. What we are talking about is a holistic approach to building energy efficiency assessment. Simplistically, it's based on a number of steps. The first step being the envelope design. So that's the walls, the floor, the roof, and of course the windows. As discussed already, the code outlines various pathways to achieve this, but fundamentally aligns them all to a minimum 7-star benchmark. Once you've designed the house, you can then calculate the overall heating and cooling loads. So the next step is to take the heating and cooling loads that you've calculated in step 1 and determine the annual energy usage of the building services, which include air conditioning, hot water, lighting, and pool and spa pumps where fitted. And the last step is to calculate the total energy demand and compare it to the regulated energy budget. Any over budget demand can be offset with on-site generation, but it's important to note that the minimum thermal envelope requirements in step 1 can't be traded below 7 stars. So if we get to step 3 and we're over budget, we can do one of 3 things. We can either improve the thermal envelope to reduce heating and cooling demands or loads, and that can be done by upgrading the windows or the wall insulation, for example. Or we could improve the efficiency of the appliances we're using, the air conditioners and hot water services, things like that. Or we can add on-site generation capacity to make up the shortfall. So that's, most commonly probably going to be solar panels. So with all of this in mind, Agri have undertaken a pretty comprehensive analysis of the data available. And I'd like to take a moment to share that with you and some of the insights we've garnered over the course of the last year. Of course, it's probably relevant to say that, like all studies, it's based on a number of assumptions, and due to the sheer number of factors, there's a great deal of variability at the micro level. But what we tend to focusing on is the more broader macro trends. We should also note that the uptake of the NCC provisions at a state government level have not been considered, as there's no way of knowing how each state will do that at this time. So we based our study on a number of different data sets, starting with the University of Melbourne study, which provided some interesting baseline projections around the impact of different glazing and frame types on overall star rating. We also took a deep dive into an absolutely massive data set provided by Tony Isaacs Consulting, who is the primary consultant on the DTS elemental provisions, which provided speculative data on impacts across 21 archetypes in 13 NatHERS climate zones and multiple orientations of each. So as you can imagine, this was huge. There's well over 1,000 dwellings modelled. The archetypes covered pretty much a wide range of houses and residential buildings, from small homes to large multi-storey homes, as well as variations in home designs across the various regions and states, and different wall types such as brick veneer, double brick, lightweight construction, etc. And also include a small number of architectural and climate-specific designs, including passive house. So anyone who attended our last webinar in May might recall this table, this chart, and the discussion around the impacts we anticipated. And just to recap, this table, which is included in our impact analysis, illustrates the percentage change expected by window type across each climate. So we've got different window and glazing options and different climates, and it's really just a reflection of the percentage change in square meterage, you might say. And we broke that down to show the differences between, the different archetypes based on affordability. So comparing smaller, low-cost housing with larger architectural building types. And in general, without going over what we've already covered too much, there are a number of conclusions that can be drawn from the study. We anticipate fairly substantial increases in IGU and high-performing frame options in colder climates. Hot climates will require increased solar control. Spectrally selective glass options will become much more commonplace. And to an extent, both of these statements is true for mixed climates, with a balance between solar control and insulation required. Of course, there are limitations to the data. For example, the Tony Isaacs study was based on the best and worst glazing options, but omits the impacts of many of the more mid-range options. But it's fair to say that this is the most expansive study or analysis done to date, and rationalised by the consultants to determine what, in their opinion, delivered the most cost-effective outcomes. A key assumption made by Tony Isaacs was the overall window areas would reduce by some 20% as a result of the move to 7 stars. However, this view was not supported by the data provided by the CSIRO, which shows that glazing areas have largely remained unchanged for class 1 houses, which is the blue line you can see here. And there is some fluctuation for apartments, the orange line, but generally speaking, we don't support this conclusion, and we've pushed back quite strenuously on this assumption. Consequently, those projections have been revised down, but they are still forecasting a small decrease in window sizes. To understand this better, we recently completed a sensitivity analysis to determine the impact of each of the variables. The study involved a detailed analysis of some 13,000 combinations of window areas compared with floor areas. So it's a very, very detailed analysis, taking into account the impact of slab on ground versus suspended flooring, different eave projections, light versus dark framing, and all the other options that we have across 3 different climate zones. Now, for context, just in terms of what it means, as we go into the next few slides, they're all presented in this kind of format where you've got the window area on the left going up as you go up, and the floor area on the right, on the bottom, going up as you go to the right. And the window to floor area ratio is shown there in those individual cells, ranging from 10 in the red to 33 in the green. And what you can see from that is the typical sort of 20% median window to floor area ratio represents a line from the bottom left to the top right. So now I've shared that with you. The data set that we're actually talking about looks nothing like that, but that's the principle for what we're talking about. The results for Climate Zone 6, so what we're looking at here is Melbourne, indicate that a typical house will have a U value of no more than about 4 in most cases. but that increasing the size of the eaves reduces thermal load and could be an alternative to upgrading windows. In most cases, IGUs with high SHGCs are required, but solar control becomes more important in smaller houses, particularly smaller houses with larger windows. This table shows the same sort of data set, but compares the impact of slab on ground against suspended timber floors. And what we can see pretty consistently is that the windows with lower SHGCs are required for homes with suspended floors than they are on slab on ground, but there's no real change in U value. In climate zone 5, which represents the coastal fringe of Sydney, Adelaide, Perth, there was almost no impact on window performance. Increasing eaves as a design option provides some benefit in smaller houses with larger glazed areas, but does not provide any measurable benefit in large or medium homes. Interestingly, the choice of floor type in climate zone 5 makes a big difference to U value, but does not significantly impact SHGC. This will almost certainly impact two-storey houses, which typically have a suspended timber floor to the upper level, and it's likely to drive some increases in double glazing in these larger homes. In Brisbane, the impact of larger eaves is barely perceptible. The maximum permissible SHGC is reduced in most instances, indicating that increasing eaves is simply just not enough to achieve 7 stars in warmer climates. Solar control glazing will be more important, but only drives minimal improvement to window U values. And the impact of floor type in Brisbane is similar to Sydney, with suspended floors typically performing much worse and requiring significant window improvement, including UA values and lower SHGCs. The HIA presented their own study last week, I think, which looked at many of the same things. The findings were based on a NATHERS assessment of a single house design in 4 orientations across the same climate zones. The base case 6-star home is shown here and is based on a smaller footprint indicative of an entry-level house with relatively low window to floor area, in this case 17%, which is a little lower than the 21% average in the CSIRO housing data portal for current 7-star homes. The HIA projections are reasonably comparable with our own, noting, of course, that this is a much smaller study considering only one house design. But with this in mind, the results seem to support similar conclusions, with double glazing becoming much more the norm for the vast majority of homes in Melbourne, regardless of other factors. In Sydney's more temperate climate, single glazing will be adequate for many slab-on-ground homes. Window upgrades are likely necessary for 2-storey and suspended floors. And generally speaking, the same is true for Brisbane, but we can add to this, our study certainly indicates that SHGC will become far more important. So moving on, the Consultation Regulatory Impact Statement, or CRIS for short, was published just last week, along with a suite of supporting documents. The report itself is 327 pages, so it's obviously going to take a little bit of time to digest, but there are a number of points that are worth talking about, particularly with regard to the conclusions. The RIS formally analyses the 2 proposed policy options outlined in the scoping study. We need to talk about what option B means first, because it's the basis for calculating option A. Option B is often referred to as the net zero regulated energy option. It is the highest stringency option of the 2, and it's based on an annual energy budget, which is calculated on a base case of 7-star thermal shell and generic appliances. Option A, formerly known or previously known as near regulated energy, is set at 70% of option B, so 30% lower than option B. We should note that both options are based on a whole of house energy budget, which can include on-site generation capacity, but minimum 7-star NATHERS equivalent thermal envelope. The CRIS evaluates the benefit cost ratio in 2 ways, from a household perspective and from an economy-wide perspective. In the household scenario, costs are based on projected increase in the upfront build costs, and benefits are based on the overall reduction in utility costs for electricity and gas. The CRIS finds that the benefit cost ratio for housing is 0.8 under option A and 0.7 for option B. That is to say that for every dollar spent on the initial build, the return for the homeowner is only 70 or 80 cents over a 10-year period. For apartments, the BCR was lower, so it's the benefit cost ratio was lower at 0.53 for option A and 0.55 for option B. Now, it gets a bit complicated, and we just haven't had time to fully evaluate how these figures have been determined, but it appears a significant driver for this lower than expected return is the impact of reduced energy usage on retail prices. Despite the reduction in overall energy usage, this does not necessarily translate to significantly lower energy prices, as fixed network costs, like the poles and the wires, and the retail costs like the call centers and marketing and accounts and all that sort of stuff make up the biggest portion of the cost to energy providers, and don't reduce, and being fixed costs, they don't reduce when households use less energy. The report more or less assumes, therefore, that the per kilowatt rate that we all pay will increase over time as we use less energy. The economy-wide analysis takes into account the net impact of the whole of society, not just individual households. Therefore, more costs are included in the analysis, specifically the cost to industry to learn about new changes, as well as costs to government. More benefits are also included, such as the benefits to lower energy costs, lower greenhouse gas emissions, and the health benefits of lower pollution, both from energy production and in the home, and avoided network investment. Under option A, the benefit cost ratio for the entire Australian economy is estimated to be 0.35 and 0.25 under option B. The overall build costs for each climate zone in each state are analysed in the report. The table shows the values for class 1. This table shows the values for class 1 houses in New South Wales and Victoria under the more stringent option A. You can see here that the largest increase to thermal shell is in New South Wales of around $1,800 and a little under $2,000 in Victoria. Additional costs for solar and hot water are shown as well, but it's unclear why hot water has been included, as this cost would have been there anyway. We don't know too many houses that don't include a hot water service, whether we're talking whole energy or not. So a little unclear there, and there's obviously a question we need to ask. The red negative values under heating and cooling represent the cost reduction for appliances as a result of the upgrade to the thermal shell. For Queensland and South Australia, it's a similar story, both having around $1,500 or $1,600 increases in construction costs. And again, it's a similar story across all other states. So all things being equal, we're at best talking about fairly minimal increases, with the total additional spend being little more than a cup of coffee a week when amortized out over 10 years. I'm not an economist, but it's hard to see how the BCR could be so low with such modest increases when you look at it this way. On the other side of the ledger, total energy savings are quantified. I'm just showing class 1 on the East Coast here. And I won't spend too much time on this, but I just want to show you how the numbers have been presented. And just to expand on that, these numbers are in megajoules of energy. And so those costs and benefits are there, then quantified in dollar terms. And as the costs are up front and the benefits are accumulated over time, the present value of each is used to determine and compare the yield, the final ratio. The tables I've presented are just a simple snapshot of what is a very extensive report. So to save time, I've just shown some key examples. And as I said, the quiz has only been out for a week. And together with the supplementary reports, there's around 1,000 pages of information to digest, which we're still going through. But I thought it was important to share with you our preliminary understandings. If you care for a bit of light reading, the full report and all of the additional information can be downloaded from the ABCB consultation portal, or just let us know. We'll be happy to send you a copy. So I guess we need to boil all that down and talk about what this all means. I think it's fair to say the overall stringency increase and impacts on glazing improvements are relatively modest, and consequently the increase in cost for thermal envelope improvements are marginal. The biggest cost increases appear to come from the introduction of the whole house methodology. So we need to untangle that a bit more to understand what's really going on. The CRIS indicates the financial benefits for homeowners are negative, with energy savings not materialising in dollar terms, with a return of around 70 or 80 cents in the dollar. There is some ambiguity as to whether all of the costs considered are real. From a macroeconomic perspective, suffice to say the CRIS does not make a strong case for the reforms. So considering the cost increases for thermal envelope are, for the most part, relatively small, the question needs to be asked, why does this not result in greater benefits? Our first impressions are that the CRIS does not take into account all of the benefits. We need to explore this in much more detail, and we obviously welcome any insight that you might be able to share with us. Secondly, we need to discuss why the results of this CRIS are so different to previous reports, which over the last 10 years have all indicated positive benefit ratios for improved thermal performance of buildings. I think it's fair to say the findings of this CRIS have come as somewhat of a bit of a surprise, considering the ASBEC report from only 3 years ago also purported BCAs of upward of 1.2. So there is some discussion in the CRIS, but we're still trying to understand this variance. As we've said, the ABCB on many occasions, and I mean many, the confluence of so many changes all at once has made it near impossible to predict the outcomes. The fact that we are delivering a full star increase, but at the same time redefining what 7 stars is with the restar banding, means we're effectively talking about moving targets. If I'm honest, we would have expected slightly more stringent outcomes in some areas, and equally a stronger benefit cost ratio. Ultimately, Agware is here to support its members, and so we need to understand your views and perspective so we can finalise Agware's position. Ahead of our ABCB submission on the 17th of October, we're seeking member feedback to inform and influence our policy settings and response in the coming weeks. We encourage you to reach out and let us know if you have any questions, concerns, or what your positions may be to inform and influence us going forward. So that concludes my presentations. I'd like to now open up for any questions.
Thanks, Ross. Has anyone got any questions? Either type in the text box or raise your hand. I'm assuming, Russ, with Zoom Room, you'll be able to unmute people.
Yep. Okay, Michael Baker. Please go ahead, Michael.
Hi, I just wanted to ask if I could grab a copy of the presentation.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
If anyone else would like a copy of the presentation, please just put a comment in the chat, and we'll organise for that to be sent to you.
Mark, you got your hand up. You please go ahead.
I was a bit quick off the. I was just after a copy of the presentation as well, so I'll chuck that in the chat. But so as far as exploring more benefits, do we have any ideas at this point where we're going to start as far as fleshing out anything that's missing?
Yeah, look, we're a week into a consultation process. I think the obvious place to start is to understand both the costs and the benefits. On the cost side of the ledger, it's possible there's some costs that aren't real. We'd like to understand that better. On the benefit side, I think we all know the benefits of more comfortable homes. I don't know how you quantify that in dollar terms, but it's got to be worth something. And I think perhaps maybe a purely financial assessment is possibly not appropriate. But I think, we need to open that up. And to be honest with you, as I said, we're an association. We represent the wider views of our members. So I'd encourage anyone to come forward with any comments you can share in terms of benefits that we should be advocating for.
I know we've talked about case studies, and look, I think there's been a couple here and there, but I suppose one idea would be could we try and turbocharge a level of before and after studies on house upgrades.
Mhm.
Look, I even from personal experience, I just moved into a substantially larger home, but with substantially better windows. And I've now got a 5-bedroom home that's more efficient than a 2-bedroom brick home that was in Melbourne, and all because I've got PVC windows that are, you know, they are very, very efficient. And you know, you only have to look at my bills and our negligible usage, and it's actually been quite surprising. But whether there can be a drive to try and you know, grab some of that sort of information.
Yeah, absolutely. Good ideas there. We'll definitely take on board that and have a look at how we can push back a little bit. I think would be the appropriate way to describe. The RIS is certainly a very forensic, very cold sort of financial review of the situation. I think there's more to the story.
Yep.
Russ, we had some questions on the text line.
Yep.
Michael Keith has asked, in the HIA assessment, the RW changes were stated for wall insulation improvement, but for glazing, it was stated as double glazing rather than a stated U value. Is there a reason why?
In the HIA analysis that was done by a consultant for the HIA, yeah, that's how they summarise the data. I haven't tried to convey the full presentation, just I guess a snapshot of the key outcomes, primarily just to, I guess, explore whether they were different or whether they were similar to our own findings. That's primarily what we're interested in understanding. Is we out on out in the weeds, or are we kind of seeing similar things here? And conclusively, I guess we are seeing sort of a similar kind of trends in terms of the levers and dials available to building designers to achieve compliance under 7 stars. And I think our study probably extends a little bit further and starts to define what those U values and solar heat gains actually are, and across the different combinations of variables.
We have another question, Russ, from Jackson, who has asked, can you quickly run over again the preliminary findings for the changes in Melbourne based on windows in terms of lower U value and SHGC?
Sure, okay. Let's go back. Melbourne, right. So in Melbourne, the way this table works is you've got your range of U values here. These empty boxes means there's no compliance above 3, a maximum U value of 3 for this combination of attributes. So 300 mil eave, 150 mil floor space, and 50 square meters of glazed area. And that's basically how every box works. So generally speaking, with the exception of perhaps a 300 mil eave in a very large house, you're talking about U values under 4 pretty consistently. Maybe if we get very small glazed areas in medium-sized and small houses, we can go a little bit higher on the U value, but yeah, there's a lot of variables there. You know, this sensitivity study is primarily looking at the comparison of the eave, and if we go to the next table, the comparison of the floor type. All of the eave projections are based on a slab on ground with best combination of outcomes.
Jackson, I hope that answers the question, but more than happy for you to reach out to Russ if there's further questions, and he can run through that probably in a little bit more detail. I hope that helps.
Yeah.
The next question that we had was Vince in the RIS on page 99. We're going to get into detail here, Vince, of the document. On page 65 of the RIS, it says 4.4.3, difficult blocks costs. The table, look, Vince, to be honest, that sounds like something that's a bit difficult to answer on the spot. I'd probably suggest that, and I'd be happy to arrange for you to reach out to Russ and have a chat. If anyone else has those same questions, happy to look into them, but it's probably something we can't do just on notice with those references. So I hope that's okay. If there's, I guess, a broader question, happy to answer it, but I think that's probably a little bit complicated for this scenario. What are the other questions? Michael O'Keefe, one is metric and the other is prescriptive. I think, I'm not sure that's a question or a statement.
Maybe a follow-up to the question you had before. And
Right.
yeah, that's a fair point is, you know, if you stated U value as a metric and just the HIA outcomes were described as being just single glaze or double glaze with no further sort of detail. Obviously, we know particularly in warm climates, solar heat gains are a key factor there. So possibly we're in a bit better position to look at a wider range of data sets.
Next, Vince has raised another question, which seems a little bit more succinct to be able to articulate. The new glazing calculator shows that for class 2 building in climate zone 7, that you can potentially use 4mm Angitech low E single glazing or a Lightbridge 412-4 double glazing unit. How is it possible to have extremes and they both comply? I can only explain this by assuming that the calculator is incorrect. My concern here is that it is unlikely that you will use a single glazing in Canberra, but the DTS provisions are basically saying that you can. Builders may ditch natters and use DTS method to put cheaper windows in a new home or apartment. I think it's probably appropriate, Russ, to outline that we have raised a couple of questions around anomalies we've found in the glazing calculator as well.
Yep. Yeah. That's I mean, fundamentally what we were doing the first half of the exercise was trying to break it, work out where its flaws were and where any errors were. We have uncovered a few that have been communicated. And then secondary to that was to model the outcomes. We've got a couple of hands up here who've been very patient. Luigi? Are you there, Luigi?
I'm unmuted now, I hope.
Great. Hi, mate.
Good. Two comments with regard to why you think there might be less of a saving now than previously done. And one is, I'm here in Perth, and basically solar is everywhere, and very few people are actually paying hardly anything for electricity. Therefore, you will not make a saving no matter what you do with the house, because you're producing your own electricity anyway. And when you feed it back in the network, the cost is very, very low that you get back. So therefore, the saving will be marginal compared to if you were consuming power. Right? So that could be one of the reasons why you're not getting the big savings that people were sort of expecting. You've already gained it in solar. The other area might be that people just don't use their air conditioning as much as they used to, because they're all conscious now of the fact that we use up so much power. I personally live in Perth. I use my air conditioner 10 days a year. You might think it's amazing for a place like Perth, but yeah, I want it on those 10 days, but the rest of the time, I just don't bother. So realistically, it's not going to make any difference to me. So that might be one of the reasons why you're getting such a low figure now compared to the past. Thank you.
Thanks, Luigi.
Okay, so even though that's the case, and I'm doing them all the same.
Luigi, you able to put yourself on mute, mate? Yeah, thanks, buddy. And Anthony, you there, mate?
Yeah, Russ, thanks. I think there was a couple of things that I picked up with the HIA presentation I went to. The deemed to satisfy is actually based on a waffle pod slab on ground, not a traditional raft slab on ground. And the other thing is that even though you might be able to use a deemed to satisfy or natters, it won't be accepted in New South Wales. So BASICs will always override in New South Wales. But I think we've discussed this previously, but there seems to be some an error or some anomalies in the glazing calculator, which leads to what Vince has said before regarding climate zone 7 particularly. So just for those on the call, the slab on ground is waffle pod, and that's where you get your big tick in terms of star rating. Thanks, mate.
Yeah, good on you. Thanks, mate. Are there any other questions?
There's a question here from Chris. I'm guessing that's from Techniform. How is it that Australia is probably the only country in the modern world to allow single glazing to be used in housing for humans? Is every other country wrong? I would expect a base level that promotes broad acceptance. I think, look, Chris, I'd suggest, unless Russ has got something to add, I think we're surprised that the outcome in the 7-star doesn't certainly mandate more double glazing. We're looking into it to understand what the reports are giving us. But equally, I know you're not alone in your perspective that certainly there should be a more high-performing window units there, and we're more than happy to take feedback as to what our response should be. So happy to take that on board. Equally, if other people share that view, we need to understand that so that we can form our perspective. So I encourage all members to reach out and help us or help inform where the association should be pushing back and where you think there are opportunities for us to refine our feedback.
Yeah. Okay.
There's a question here from Mr. Gary Smith. Will AGWA give feedback that as an industry we feel that is the stringency should increase? And how do we reach government future set targets with such a small increase and another change not happening for another 3 years with the next NCC version? Look, Gary, the first instance would be that this is our opportunity to outline what we're seeing. Companies such as yourselves and the others that have outlined perspectives on the call, we want to hear your feedback. You know, I've always articulated that we work on the weighted average of opinions in terms of where we're at, and you know that's certainly where our intent. So the more we understand around members' feedback around what our response should be, that will form our response. I've certainly, it's fair to say, been provided with a lot of people who feel that the stringency should go further, and I'm hearing that, but we're in the process of trying to understand those perspectives, and then there'll be likely a discussion at the board level in the coming weeks to work out where we land and to work with our technical committees to articulate and refine our position going back to the NCC. I think I answered the question. Yep, Matt would like the presentation. Sorry, I'm just reading the next question.
Got one from Phil Trimnell. He says his mic's not working. Never mind, Phil. Given the RIS outcome, is there realistically any chance 7 stars or other aspects of the proposed changes might not happen? And when will we know for sure? That's a really good question, actually. It is a consultation RIS, and it's specifically intended to inform that decision as to whether the 3 options. So we've got option 1 and option 2 that were outlined in the scoping study and have been developed. The third option is business as usual, nothing. And that is an option that the government will consider. I wouldn't, and just follow up to that, I wouldn't like to predict. It's not our decision to make, but we'll certainly be advocating for 7 stars as an absolute minimum, I think, would be reading the room. And in fact, possibly that the provisions don't go far enough. Not sure, Lyndon, if we've got any more questions.
No, there's just some feedback, I think. Look, if anyone has any further questions, happy to type them in. If anyone would like to reach out to Russ or I, we're more than happy to take your call. Or, you know, this is about understanding where the industry sees us going and working through that consultation process. I think as a general comment, I hope everyone's found today helpful. You know, by no means is there answers to all of it. We're still working through quite an extensive volume of work, I guess, in certainly the consultation RIS. But we're here to support you as our valued members and to also make sure we land on something that is important, and particularly as a window and glass industry, the role of our products play an important part in the built environment, and it's important as the peak industry body that we get our positioning correct to represent you. Thank you very much. Sorry, there's one more question from Gary that's just come in. Russ, what about pushing maximum U values of say 3 or 4? I think I'd probably answer that, Gary, say, look, we have had a number of people who have articulated potentially that our position should look at maximum U values as a response. You're not alone, and I'd certainly encourage those that you know, share that view to articulate it. Equally, if that's a strategy that's not in line with where you see our industry needing to be, feel free to let us know too. We're working to try and make sure that we are consulting and engaging and representing the breadth of our industry.